Facing the Flag. Chapter 1. Healthful House. The carte de visite received that day, June 15, 189, by the director of the establishment of Healthful House was a very neat one, and simply bore, without escutcheon or coronet, the name Count d'Artigas. Below this name, in a corner of the card, the following address was written in lead pencil. On board the schooner Ebba, anchored off New Bern, Pamlico Sound. The capital of North Carolina, one of the 44 states of the Union at this epoch, is the rather important town of Raleigh, which is about 150 miles in the interior of the province. It is owing to its central position that this city has become the seat of the state legislature, for there are others that equal and even surpass it in industrial and commercial importance, such as Wilmington, Charlotte, Fayetteville, Edenton, Washington, Salisbury, Tarboro, Halifax, and New Bern. The latter town is situated on estuary of the Neuse River, which empties itself into Pamlico Sound, a sort of vast maritime lake protected by a natural dike formed by the isles and islets of the Carolina coast. The director of Healthful House could never have imagined why the card should have been sent to him, had it not been accompanied by a note from the Count d'Artigas soliciting permission to visit the establishment. The personage in question hoped that the director would grant his request, and announced that he would present himself in the afternoon, accompanied by Captain Spade, commander of the schooner Ebba. This desire to penetrate to the interior of the celebrated sanitarium, then in great request by the wealthy invalids of the United States, was natural enough on the part of a foreigner. Others who did not bear such a high-sounding name as the Count d'Artigas had visited it, and had been unstinting in their compliments to the director. The latter therefore hastened to accord the authorization demanded, and added that he would be honored to open the doors of the establishment to the Count d'Artigas. Healthful House, which contained a select personnel, and was assured of the cooperation of the most celebrated doctors in the country, was a private enterprise. Independent of hospitals and almshouses, but subjected to the surveillance of the state, it comprised all the conditions of comfort and salubrity essential to establishments of this description designed to receive an opulent clientele. It would have been difficult to find a more agreeable situation than that of Healthful House. On the landward slope of a hill extended a park of 200 acres, planted with the magnificent vegetation that grows so luxuriantly in that part of North America, which is equal in latitude to the Canary and Madeira Islands. At the furthermost limit of the park lay the wide estuary of the Neuse, swept by the cool breezes of Pamlico Sound and by the winds that blew from the ocean beyond the narrow Lido of the coast. Healthful House, where rich invalids were cared for under such excellent hygienic conditions, was more generally reserved for the treatment of chronic complaints. But the management did not decline to admit patients affected by mental troubles, when the latter were not of an incurable nature. It thus happened, a circumstance that was bound to attract a good deal of attention to Healthful House, and which perhaps was the motive for the visit of the Count d'Artigas, that a person of worldwide notoriety had for 18 months been under special observation there. This person was a Frenchman named Thomas Roch, 45 years of age. He was, beyond question, suffering from some mental malady, but expert alienists admitted that he had not entirely lost the use of his reasoning faculties. It was only too evident that he had lost all notion of things as far as the ordinary acts of life were concerned, but in regard to subjects demanding the exercise of his genius, his sanity was unimpaired and unassailable, a fact which demonstrates how true is the dictum that genius and madness are often closely allied. Otherwise, his condition manifested itself by complete loss of memory, the impossibility of concentrating his attention upon anything, lack of judgment, delirium, and incoherence. He no longer even possessed the natural animal instinct of self-preservation, and had to be watched like an infant, whom one never permits out of one's sight. Therefore a warder was detailed to keep close watch over him by day and by night in Pavilion No. 17, at the end of Healthful House Park, which had been specially set apart for him. Ordinary insanity, when it is not incurable, can only be cured by moral means. Medicine and therapeutics are powerless, and their inefficacy has long been recognized by specialists. Were these moral means applicable to the case of Thomas Roch? One may be permitted to doubt it, even amid the tranquil and salubrious surroundings of Healthful House. As a matter of fact, the very symptoms of uneasiness, changes of temper, irritability, queer traits of character, melancholy, apathy, and a repugnance for serious occupations were distinctly apparent. No treatment seemed capable of curing or even alleviating these symptoms. This was patent to all his medical attendants. It has been justly remarked that madness is an excess of subjectivity, that is to say, a state in which the mind accords too much to mental labor and not enough to outward impressions. In the case of Thomas Rock, this indifference was practically absolute. He lived but within himself, so to speak, a prey to a fixed idea which had brought him to the condition in which we find him. Could any circumstance occur to counteract it, to exteriorize him, as it were? The thing was improbable, but it was not impossible. It is now necessary to explain how this Frenchman came to quit France, what motive attracted him to the United States, why the federal government had judged it prudent and necessary to intern him in this sanitarium, where every utterance that unconsciously escaped him during his crises were noted and recorded with the minutest care. 18 months previously, the Secretary of the Navy at Washington had received a demand for an audience in regard to a communication that Thomas Rock desired to make to him. As soon as he glanced at the name, the secretary perfectly understood the nature of the communication and the terms which would accompany it, and an immediate audience was unhesitatingly accorded. Thomas Rock's notoriety was indeed such that, out of solicitude for the interests confided to his keeping, and which he was bound to safeguard, he could not hesitate to receive the petitioner and listen to the proposals which the latter desired personally to submit to him. Thomas Rock was an inventor of genius. Several important discoveries had brought him prominently to the notice of the world. Thanks to him, problems that had previously remained purely theoretical had received practical application. He occupied a conspicuous place in the front rank of the army of science. It will be seen how worry, deceptions, mortification, and the outrages with which he was overwhelmed by the cynical wits of the press combined to drive him to that degree of madness which necessitated his internment in Healthful House. His latest invention in war engines bore the name of Rock's fulgurator. This apparatus possessed, if he was to be believed, such superiority over all others, that the state which acquired it would become absolute master of earth and ocean. The deplorable difficulties inventors encounter in connection with their inventions are only too well known, especially when they endeavor to get them adopted by governmental commissions. Several of the most celebrated examples are still fresh in everybody's memory. It is useless to insist upon this point, because there are sometimes circumstances underlying affairs of this kind upon which it is difficult to obtain any light. In regard to Thomas Rock, however, it is only fair to say that, as in the case of the majority of his predecessors, his pretensions were excessive. He placed such an exorbitant price upon his new engine that it was practicably impossible to treat with him. This was due to the fact, and it should not be lost sight of, that in respect of previous inventions which had been most fruitful in result, he had been imposed upon with the greatest audacity. Being unable to obtain therefrom the profits which he had a right to expect, his temper had become soured. He became suspicious, would give up nothing without knowing just what he was doing, impose conditions that were perhaps unacceptable, wanted his mere assertions accepted as sufficient guarantee, and in any case asked for such a large sum of money on account before condescending to furnish the test of practical experiment that his overtures could not be entertained. In the first place, he had offered the fulgurator to France, and made known the nature of it to the commission appointed to pass upon his proposition. The fulgurator was a sort of autopropulsive engine, of peculiar construction, charged with an explosive composed of new substances, and which only produced its effect under the action of a deflagrator that was also new. When this engine, no matter in what way it was launched, exploded, not on striking the object aimed at, but several hundred yards from it, its action upon the atmospheric strata was so terrific that any construction, warship or floating battery, within a zone of 12,000 square yards, would be blown to atoms. This was the principle of the shell launched by the Zelinsky pneumatic gun, with which experiments had already been made at that epoch, but its results were multiplied at least 100-fold. If, therefore, Thomas Rock's invention possessed this power, it assured the offensive and defensive superiority of his native country. But might not the inventor be exaggerating, notwithstanding that the tests of other engines he had conceived had proved incontestably that they were all he had claimed them to be. This experiment could alone show, and it was precisely here where the rub came in. Rock would not agree to experiment until the millions at which he valued his fulgurator had first been paid to him. It is certain that a sort of disequilibrium had then occurred in his mental faculties. It was felt that he was developing a condition of mind that would gradually lead to definite madness. No government could possibly condescend to treat with him under the conditions he imposed. The French Commission was compelled to break off all negotiations with him, and the newspapers, even those of the radical opposition, had to admit that it was difficult to follow up the affair. In view of the excess of subjectivity, which was unceasingly augmenting in the profoundly disturbed mind of Thomas Rock, no one will be surprised at the fact that the chord of patriotism gradually relaxed until it ceased to vibrate. For the honor of human nature, be it said that Thomas Rock was by this time irresponsible for his actions. He preserved his whole consciousness only in so far as subjects bearing directly upon his invention were concerned. In this particular, he had lost nothing of his mental power. But in all that related to the most ordinary details of existence, his moral decrepitude increased daily and deprived him of complete responsibility for his acts. Thomas Rock's invention having been refused by the Commission, steps ought to have been taken to prevent him from offering it elsewhere. Nothing of the kind was done, and there a great mistake was made. The inevitable was bound to happen, and it did. Under a growing irritability, the sentiment of patriotism, which is the very essence of the citizen, who before belonging to himself belongs to his country, became extinct in the soul of the disappointed inventor. His thoughts turned towards other nations. He crossed the frontier, and forgetting the ineffaceable past, offered the fulgurator to Germany. There, as soon as his exorbitant demands were made known, the government refused to receive his communication. Besides, it so happened that the military authorities were just then absorbed by the construction of a new ballistic engine, and imagined they could afford to ignore that of the French inventor. As the result of this second rebuff, Rock's anger became coupled with hatred, an instinctive hatred of humanity, especially after his pourparlers with the British Admiralty came to naught. The English, being practical people, did not at first repulse Thomas Rock. They sounded him and tried to get round him, but Rock would listen to nothing. His secret was worth millions, and these millions he would have, or they would not have his secret. The Admiralty at last declined to have anything more to do with him. It was in these conditions, when his intellectual trouble was growing daily worse, that he made a last effort by approaching the American government. That was about 18 months before this story opens. The Americans, being even more practical than the English, did not attempt to bargain for Rock's fulgurator, to which, in view of the French chemist's reputation, they attached exceptional importance. They rightly esteemed him a man of genius, and took the measures justified by his condition, prepared to indemnify him equitably later. As Thomas Rock gave only two visible proofs of mental alienation, the administration, in the very interest of his invention, judged it prudent to sequestrate him. As is already known, he was not confined in a lunatic asylum, but was conveyed to Healthful House, which offered every guarantee for the proper treatment of his malady. Yet, though the most careful attention had been devoted to him, no improvement had manifested itself. Thomas Rock, let it be again remarked, this point cannot be too often insisted upon, incapable though he was of comprehending and performing the ordinary acts and duties of life, recovered all his powers when the field of his discoveries was touched upon. He became animated, and spoke with the assurance of a man who knows whereof he is descanting, and an authority that carried conviction with it. In the heat of his eloquence, he would describe the marvelous qualities of his fulgurator and the truly extraordinary effects it caused. As to the nature of the explosive and of the deflagrator, the elements of which the latter was composed, their manufacture, and the way in which they were employed, he preserved complete silence, and all attempts to worm the secret out of him remained ineffectual. Once or twice, during the height of the paroxysms to which he was occasionally subject, there had been reason to believe that his secret would escape him, and every precaution had been taken to note his slightest utterance. But Thomas Rock had each time disappointed his watchers. If he no longer preserved the sentiment of self-preservation, he at least knew how to preserve the secret of his discovery. Pavilion number 17 was situated in the middle of a garden that was surrounded by hedges, and here Rock was accustomed to take exercise under the surveillance of his guardian. This guardian lived in the same pavilion, slept in the same room with him, and kept constant watch upon him, never leaving him for an hour. He hung upon the lightest words uttered by the patient in the course of his hallucinations, which generally occurred in the intermediary state between sleeping and waking, watched and listened while he dreamed. This guardian was known as Gaydon. Shortly after the sequestration of Thomas Rock, having learned that an attendant speaking French fluently was wanted, he had applied at Healthful House for the place, and had been engaged to look after the new inmate. In reality, the alleged Gaydon was a French engineer named Simon Hart, who for several years past had been connected with a manufactory of chemical products in New Jersey. Simon Hart was 40 years of age. His high forehead was furrowed with the wrinkle that denoted the thinker, and his resolute bearing denoted energy combined with tenacity. Extremely well-versed in the various questions relating to the perfecting of modern armaments, Hart knew everything that had been invented in the shape of explosives, of which there were over 1,100 at that time, and was fully able to appreciate such a man as Thomas Rock. He firmly believed in the power of the latter's fulgurator, and had no doubt whatever that the inventor had conceived an engine that was capable of revolutionizing the condition of both offensive and defensive warfare on land and sea. He was aware that the demon of insanity had respected the man of science, and that in Rock's partially diseased brain the flame of genius still burned brightly. Then it occurred to him that if, during Rock's crises, his secret was revealed, this invention of a Frenchman would be seized upon by some other country to the detriment of France. Impelled by a spirit of patriotism, he made up his mind to offer himself as Thomas Rock's guardian, by passing himself off as an American thoroughly conversant with the French language, in order that if the inventor did at any time disclose his secret, France alone should benefit thereby. On pretext of returning to Europe, he resigned his position at the New Jersey manufactory and changed his name so that none should know what had become of him. Thus it came to pass that Simon Hart, alias Gaydon, had been an attendant at Healthful House for 15 months. It required no little courage on the part of a man of his position and education to perform the menial and exacting duties of an insane man's attendant. But as has been before remarked, he was actuated by a spirit of the purest and noblest patriotism. The idea of depriving Rock of the legitimate benefits due to the inventor, if he succeeded in learning his secret, never for an instant entered his mind. He had kept the patient under the closest possible observation for 15 months, yet had not been able to learn anything from him, or worm out of him a single reply to his questions that was of the slightest value. But he had become more convinced than ever of the importance of Thomas Rock's discovery, and was extremely apprehensive lest the partial madness of the inventor should become general, or lest he should die during one of his paroxysms, and carry his secret with him to the grave. This was Simon Hart's position, and this, the mission to which he had wholly devoted himself in the interest of his native country. However, notwithstanding his deceptions and troubles, Thomas Rock's physical health, thanks to his vigorous constitution, was not particularly affected. A man of medium height, with a large head, high, wide forehead, strongly cut features, iron-gray hair and mustache, eyes generally haggard, but which became piercing and imperious when illuminated by his dominant idea, thin lips closely compressed, as though to prevent the escape of a word that could betray his secret. Such was the inventor confined in one of the pavilions of Healthful House, probably unconscious of his sequestration, and confided to the surveillance of Simon Hart the engineer, become Gaydon the warder. Chapter 2. Count d'Artigas. Just who was this Count d'Artigas? A Spaniard, so his name would appear to indicate. Yet on the stern of his schooner, in letters of gold, was the name Ebba, which is of pure Norwegian origin. And had you asked him the name of the captain of the Ebba, he would have replied Spade, and would doubtless have added that of the boatswain was Effrondat, and that of the ship's cook, Helm, all singularly dissimilar and indicating very different nationalities. Could any plausible hypothesis be deducted from the type presented by Count d'Artigas? Not easily. If the color of his skin, his black hair, and the easy grace of his attitude denoted a Spanish origin, the ensemble of his person showed none of the racial characteristics peculiar to the natives of the Iberian Peninsula. He was a man of about 45 years of age, about the average height, and robustly constituted. With his calm and haughty demeanor, he resembled an Hindu lord in whose blood might mingle that of some superb type of Malay. If he was not naturally of a cold temperament, he at least, with his imperious gestures and brevity of speech, endeavored to make it appear that he was. As to the language usually spoken by him and his crew, it was one of those idioms current in the islands of the Indian Ocean and the adjacent seas. Yet when his maritime excursions brought him to the coasts of the Old or New World, he spoke English with remarkable facility, and with so slight an accent as to scarcely betray his foreign origin. None could have told anything about his past, nor even about his present life, nor from what source he derived his fortune, obviously a large one, inasmuch as he was able to gratify his every whim and lived in the greatest luxury whenever he visited America, nor where he resided when at home, nor where was the port from which his schooner hailed, and none would have ventured to question him upon any of these points, so little disposed was he to be communicative. He was not the kind of man to give anything away or compromise himself in the slightest degree, even when interviewed by American reporters. All that was known about him was what was published in the papers when the arrival of the Ebba was reported in some port, and particularly in the ports of the east coast of the United States, where the schooner was accustomed to put in at regular periods to lay in provisions and stores for a lengthy voyage. She would take on board not only flour, biscuits, preserves, fresh and dried meat, livestock, wines, beers, and spirits, but also clothing, household utensils, and objects of luxury, all of the finest quality and highest price, and which were paid for either in dollars, guineas, or other coins of various countries and denominations. Consequently, if no one knew anything about the private life of Count d'Artigas, he was nevertheless very well known in the various ports of the United States, from the Florida Peninsula to New England. It is therefore in no way surprising that the director of Healthful House should have felt greatly flattered by the Count's visit, and have received him with every mark of honor and respect. It was the first time that the schooner Ebba had dropped anchor in the port of New Bern, and no doubt a mere whim of her owner had brought him to the mouth of the Neuse. Otherwise, why should he have come to such a place? Certainly not to lay in stores, for Pamlico Sound offered neither the resources nor facilities to be found in such ports as Boston, New York, Dover, Savannah, Wilmington in North Carolina, and Charleston in South Carolina. What could he have procured with his piasters and banknotes in the small markets of New Bern? This chief town of Craven County contained barely 6,000 inhabitants. Its commerce consisted principally in the exportation of grain, pigs, furniture, and naval munitions. Besides, a few weeks previously, the schooner had loaded up for some destination which, as usual, was unknown. Had this enigmatical personage then come solely for the purpose of visiting Healthful House? Very likely. There would have been nothing surprising in the fact, seeing that the establishment enjoyed a high and well-merited reputation. Or perhaps the Count had been inspired by curiosity to meet Thomas Rock. This curiosity would have been legitimate and natural enough in view of the universal renown of the French inventor. Fancy, a mad genius who claimed that his discoveries were destined to revolutionize the methods of modern military art. As he had notified the director he would do, the Count d'Artigas presented himself in the afternoon at the door of Healthful House, accompanied by Captain Spade, the commander of the Ebba. In conformity with orders given, both were admitted and conducted to the office of the director. The latter received his distinguished visitor with empressement, placed himself at his disposal, and intimated his intention of personally conducting him over the establishment, not being willing to concede to anybody else the honor of being his cicerone. The Count, on his part, was profuse in the expression of his thanks for the considerations extended to him. They went over the common rooms and private habitations of the establishment, the director prattling unceasingly about the care with which the patients were tended, much better care, if he was to be believed, than they could possibly have had in the bosoms of their families, and priding himself upon the results achieved, and which had earned for the place its well-merited success. The Count d'Artigas listened to his ceaseless chatter with apparent interest, probably in order the better to dissemble the real motive of his visit. However, after going the rounds for an hour, he ventured to remark, "Have you not among your patients, sir, one anent whom there was a great deal of talk some time ago, and whose presence here contributed in no small measure to attract public attention to Healthful House?" You refer to Thomas Rock, I presume, Count, queried the director. Precisely, that Frenchman, that inventor, whose mental condition is said to be very precarious. Very precarious, Count, and happily so, perhaps. In my opinion, humanity has nothing to gain by his discoveries, the application of which would increase the already too numerous means of destruction. You speak wisely, sir, and I entirely agree with you. Real progress does not lie in that direction, and I regard as inimical to society all those who seek to follow it. But has this inventor entirely lost the use of his intellectual faculties? Entirely, no, save as regards the ordinary things of life. In this respect, he no longer possesses either comprehension or responsibility. His genius as an inventor, however, remains intact. It has survived his moral degeneracy, and had his insensate demands been complied with, I have no doubt he would have produced a new war engine, which the world can get along very well without. Very well without, as you say, sir, re-echoed the Count d'Artigas, and Captain Spade nodded approval. But you will be able to judge for yourself, Count, for here is the pavilion occupied by Thomas Rock. If his confinement is well justified from the point of view of public security, he is nonetheless treated with all the consideration due to him and the attention which his condition necessitates. Besides, Healthful House is beyond the reach of indiscreet persons who might. The director completed the phrase with a significant motion of his head, which brought an imperceptible smile to the lips of the stranger. But, asked the Count, is Thomas Rock never left alone? Never, Count, never. He has a permanent attendant in whom we have implicit confidence, who speaks his language and keeps the closest possible watch upon him. If in some way or other some indication relative to his discovery were to escape him, it would be immediately noted down, and its value would be passed upon by those competent to judge. Here the Count d'Artigas stole a rapid and meaning glance at Captain Spade, who responded with a gesture which said plainly enough, I understand. And had anyone observed the captain during the visit, they could not have failed to remark that he examined with the greatest minuteness that portion of the park surrounding Pavilion No. 17, and the different paths leading to the latter, probably in view of some prearranged scheme. The garden of the pavilion was near the high wall surrounding the property, from the foot of which on the other side, the hill sloped gently to the right bank of the Neuse. The pavilion itself was a one-story building surmounted by a terrace in the Italian style. It contained 2 rooms and an anteroom with strongly barred windows. On each side and in rear of the habitation were clusters of fine trees, which were then in full leaf. In front was a cool, green velvety lawn, ornamented with shrubs and brilliantly tinted flowers. The whole garden extended over about half an acre, and was reserved exclusively for the use of Thomas Rock, who was free to wander about it at pleasure under the surveillance of his guardian. When the Count d'Artigas, Captain Spade, and the director entered the garden, the first person they saw was the warder Gaydon, standing at the door of the pavilion. Unnoticed by the director, the Count d'Artigas eyed the attendant with singular persistence. It was not the first time that strangers had come to see the occupant of Pavilion No. 17, for the French inventor was justly regarded as the most interesting inmate of Healthful House. Nevertheless, Gaydon's attention was attracted by the originality of the type presented by the 2 visitors, of whose nationality he was ignorant. If the name of the Count d'Artigas was not unfamiliar to him, he had never had occasion to meet that wealthy gentleman during the latter's sojourn in the eastern ports. He therefore had no idea as to who the Count was. Neither was he aware that the schooner Ebba was then anchored at the entrance to the Neuse, at the foot of the hill upon which Healthful House was situated. Gaydon, demanded the director, where is Thomas Rock? Yonder, replied the warder, pointing to a man who was walking meditatively under the trees in rear of the pavilion. The Count d'Artigas has been authorized to visit Healthful House, the director explained, and does not wish to go away without having seen Thomas Rock, who was lately the subject of a good deal too much discussion. And who would be talked about a great deal more, added the Count, had the federal government not taken the precaution to confine him in this establishment. A necessary precaution, Count. Necessary, as you observe, Mr. Director. It is better for the peace of the world that his secret should die with him. After having glanced at the Count d'Artigas, Gaydon had not uttered a word. But preceding the two strangers, he walked towards the clump of trees where the inventor was pacing back and forth. Thomas Rock paid no attention to them. He appeared to be oblivious of their presence. Meanwhile, Captain Spade, while being careful not to excite suspicion, had been minutely examining the immediate surroundings of the pavilion and the end of the park in which it was situated. From the top of the sloping alleys, he could easily distinguish the peak of a mast, which showed above the wall of the park. He recognized the peak at a glance as being that of the Ebba, and knew therefore that the wall at this part skirted the right bank of the Neuse. The Count d'Artigas' whole attention was concentrated upon the French inventor. The latter's health appeared to have suffered in no way from his 18 months' confinement, but his queer attitude, his incoherent gestures, his haggard eye, and his indifference to what was passing around him testified only too plainly to the degeneration of his mental faculties. At length Thomas Rock dropped into a seat, and with the end of a switch traced in the sand of the alley the outline of a fortification. Then kneeling down, he made a number of little mounds that were evidently intended to represent bastions. He next plucked some leaves from a neighboring tree and stuck them in the mounds like so many tiny flags. All this was done with the utmost seriousness, and without any attention whatever being paid to the onlookers. It was the amusement of a child, but a child would have lacked this characteristic gravity. "Is he then absolutely mad?" demanded the Count d'Artigas, who in spite of his habitual impassibility appeared to be somewhat disappointed. "I warned you, Count, that nothing could be obtained from him. Couldn't he at least pay some attention to us? It would perhaps be difficult to induce him to do so." Then turning to the attendant, "Speak to him, Gaydon, perhaps he will answer you." "Oh, he'll answer me right enough, sir, never fear," replied Gaydon. He went up to the inventor and touching him on the shoulder, said gently, "Thomas Rock." The latter raised his head, and of the persons present he doubtless saw but his keeper, though Captain Spade had come up and all formed a circle about him. "Thomas Rock," continued Gaydon, speaking in English, "here are some visitors to see you. They are interested in your health in your work." The last word alone seemed to rouse him from his indifference. "My work," he replied also in English, which he spoke like a native. Then taking a pebble between his index finger and bent thumb, as a boy plays at marbles, he projected it against one of the little sand heaps. It scattered, and he jumped for joy. "Blown to pieces, the bastion is blown to pieces. My explosive has destroyed everything at one blow," he shouted, the light of triumph flashing in his eyes. "You see," said the director, addressing the Count d'Artigas, "the idea of his invention never leaves him." "And it will die with him," affirmed the attendant. "Couldn't you, Gaydon, get him to talk about his fulgurator?" asked his chief. "I will try, if you order me to do so, sir." "Well, I do order you, for I think it might interest the Count d'Artigas." "Certainly," assented the Count, whose physiognomy betrayed no sign of the sentiments which were agitating him. "I ought to warn you that I risk bringing on another fit," observed Gaydon. "You can drop the conversation when you consider it prudent. Tell Thomas Rock that a foreigner wishes to negotiate with him for the purchase of his fulgurator." "But are you not afraid he may give his secret away?" questioned the Count. He spoke with such vivacity that Gaydon could not restrain a glance of distrust, which, however, did not appear to disturb the equanimity of that impenetrable nobleman. "No fear of that," said the warder. "No promise would induce him to divulge his secret. Until the millions he demands are counted into his hand, he will remain as mute as a stone." "I don't happen to be carrying those millions about me," remarked the Count quietly. Gaydon again touched Rock on the shoulder and repeated, "Thomas Rock, here are some foreigners who are anxious to acquire your invention." The madman started. "My invention," he cried, "my deflagrator." And his growing animation plainly indicated the imminence of the fit that Gaydon had been apprehensive about, and which questions of this character invariably brought on. "How much will you give me for it, how much?" continued Rock. "How much, how much?" $10 million, replied Gaydon. 10 millions, 10 millions. A fulgurator 10 million times more powerful than anything hitherto invented. 10 millions for an autopropulsive projectile which, when it explodes, destroys everything in sight within a radius of over 12,000 square yards. 10 millions for the only deflagrator that can provoke its explosion. Why, all the wealth of the world wouldn't suffice to purchase the secret of my engine, and rather than sell it at such a price, I would cut my tongue in half with my teeth. 10 millions, when it is worth a billion, a billion, a billion. It was clear that Rock had lost all notion of things, and had Gaydon offered him 10 billions, the madman would have replied in exactly the same manner. The Count d'Artigas and Captain Spade had not taken their eyes off him. The Count was impassible as usual, though his brow had darkened, but the captain shook his head in a manner that implied plainly, "Decidedly, there is nothing to hope from this poor devil." After his outburst, Rock fled across the garden crying hoarsely, "Billions, billions." Gaydon turned to the director and remarked, "I told you how it would be." Then he rushed after his patient, caught him by the arm, and led him, without any attempt at resistance, into the pavilion and closed the door. The Count d'Artigas remained alone with the director, Captain Spade having strolled off again in the direction of the wall at the bottom of the park. "You see, I was not guilty of exaggeration, Count," said the director. "It is obvious to everyone that Thomas Rock is becoming daily worse. In my opinion, his case is a hopeless one. If all the money he asks for were offered to him, nothing could be got from him." "Very likely," replied the Count. "Still, if his pecuniary demands are supremely absurd, he has none the less invented an engine the power of which is infinite, one might say." "That is the opinion expressed by competent persons, Count, but what he has discovered will ere long be lost with himself in one of these fits which are becoming more frequent and intense. Very soon even the motive of interest, the only sentiment that appears to have survived in his mind, will become extinct." "Mayhap the sentiment of hatred will remain, though," muttered the Count, as Spade joined them at the garden gate. Chapter 3. Kidnapped. Half an hour later, the Count d'Artigas and Captain Spade were following the beach-lined road that separated the Healthful House estate from the right bank of the Neuse. Both had taken leave of the director, the latter declaring himself greatly honored by their visit, and the former thanking him warmly for his courteous reception. $100 bill left as a tip for the staff of the establishment had certainly not belied the Count's reputation for generosity. He was, there could be no doubt about it, a foreigner of the highest distinction, if distinction be measured by generosity. Issuing by the gate at the main entrance to Healthful House, they had skirted the wall that surrounded the property, and which was high enough to preclude the possibility of climbing it. Not a word passed between them for some time. The Count was deep in thought, and Captain Spade was not in the habit of addressing him without being first spoken to. At last, when they stood beneath the rear wall behind which, though it was not visible, the Count knew pavilion number 17 was situated, he said, "You managed, I presume, to thoroughly explore the place, and are acquainted with every detail of it." "Certainly, Count," replied Captain Spade, emphasizing the title. "You are perfectly sure about it?" "Perfectly. I could go through the park with my eyes shut. If you still persist in carrying out your scheme, the pavilion can be easily reached." "I do persist, Spade." "Notwithstanding Thomas Rock's mental condition." "Notwithstanding his condition, and if we succeed in carrying him off." "That is my affair. When night comes on, I undertake to enter the park of Healthful House, and then the pavilion garden without being seen by anybody." "By the entrance gate?" "No, on this side." "Yes, but on this side there is the wall, and if you succeed in climbing it, how are you going to get over it again with Thomas Rock? What if the madman cries out? What if he should resist? What if his keeper gives the alarm?" "Don't worry yourself in the least about that. We have only got to go in and come out by this door." Captain Spade pointed to a narrow door let into the wall a few paces distant, and which was doubtless used by the staff of the establishment when they had occasion to go out by the river. "That is the way I propose to go in. It's much easier than scaling the wall with a ladder." "But the door is closed." "It will open." "Has it no bolts?" "Yes, but I shot them back while we were strolling about, and the director didn't notice what I had done." "How are you going to open it?" queried the Count, going to the door. "Here is the key," replied Spade, producing it. He had withdrawn it from the lock, where it happened to be, when he had unbolted the door. "Capital," exclaimed the Count. "It couldn't be better. The business will be easier than I expected. Let us get back to the schooner. At 8 o'clock one of the boats will put you ashore with 5 men." "Yes, 5 men will do," said Captain Spade. "There will be enough of them to effect our object even if the keeper is aroused, and it becomes necessary to put him out of the way." "Put him out of the way, well, if it becomes absolutely necessary of course you must. But it would be better to seize him too, and bring him aboard the Ebba, who knows, but what he has already learned a part of Rock's secret." "True. Besides, Thomas Rock is used to him, and I don't propose to make him change his habitudes in any way." This observation was accompanied by such a significant smile that Captain Spade could entertain no doubt as to the role reserved for the warder of Healthful House. The plan to kidnap them both was thus settled, and appeared to have every chance of being successful, unless during the couple of hours of daylight that yet remained it was noticed that the key of the door had been stolen and the bolts drawn back. Captain Spade and his men could at least count upon being able to enter the park, and the rest, the captain affirmed, would be easy enough. Thomas Rock was the only patient in the establishment isolated and kept under special surveillance. All the other invalids lived in the main building or occupied pavilions in the front of the park. The plan was to try and seize Rock and Gaydon separately and bind and gag them before they could cry out. The Count d'Artigas and his companion wended their way to a creek where one of the Ebba's boats awaited them. The schooner was anchored 2 cable lengths from the shore, her sails neatly rolled upon her yards, which were squared as neatly as those of a pleasure yacht or of a man-o'-war. At the peak of the mainmast, a narrow red pennant was gently swayed by the wind, which came in fitful puffs from the east. The Count and the captain jumped into the boat, and a few strokes of the 4 oars brought them alongside of the schooner. They climbed on deck, and going forward to the jib-boom, leaned over the starboard bulwark and gazed at an object that floated on the water a few strokes ahead of the vessel. It was a small buoy that was rocked by the ripple of the ebbing tide. Twilight gradually set in, and the outline of New Bern on the left bank of the sinuous Neuse became more and more indistinct until it disappeared in the deepening shades of night. A mist set in from the sea, but though it obscured the moon, it brought no sign of rain. The lights gleamed out one by one in the houses of the town. The fishing smacks came slowly up the river to their anchorage, impelled by the oars of their crews, which struck the water with sharp, rhythmical strokes, and with their sails distended on the chance of catching an occasional puff of the dropping wind to help them along. A couple of steamers passed, sending up volumes of black smoke and myriads of sparks from their double stacks, and lashing the water into foam with their powerful paddles. At 8 o'clock, the Count d'Artigas appeared on the schooner's deck, accompanied by a man about 50 years of age, to whom he remarked, "It is time to go, Serko." "Very well, I will tell Spade," replied Serko. At that moment the captain joined them. "You had better get ready to go," said the Count. "All is ready. Be careful to prevent any alarm being given, and arrange matters so that no one will for a minute suspect that Thomas Rock and his keeper have been brought on board the Ebba." "They wouldn't find them if they came to look for them," observed Serko, shrugging his shoulders and laughing heartily as though he had perpetrated a huge joke. "Nevertheless, it is better not to arouse their suspicion," said d'Artigas. The boat was lowered, and Captain Spade and 5 sailors took their places in it. 4 of the latter got out the oars. The boatswain, Effrondat, who was to remain in charge of the boat, went to the stern beside Captain Spade and took the tiller. "Good luck, Spade," said Serko with a smile, "and don't make more noise about it than if you were a gallant carrying off his ladylove." "I won't, unless that Gaydon chap." "We must have both Rock and Gaydon," insisted the Count d'Artigas. "That is understood," replied Spade. The boat pushed off, and the sailors on the deck of the schooner watched it till it was lost to sight in the darkness. Pending its return, no preparations for the Ebba's departure were made. Perhaps there was no intention of quitting the port after the men had been kidnapped. Besides, how could the vessel have reached the open sea? Not a breath of air was now stirring, and in half an hour the tide would be setting in again, and rising strongly and rapidly for several miles above New Bern.